Welcome back to the Hate Meditations podcast. If you are a regular listener and you are noting the period of time since our last upload, just don't tell anyone, yeah? And if you are a new listener and you just thought you'd click on this video, click off. It's not aimed at you, is it? Fuck's sake. So, yeah, we thought just to get back in the swing of it, we would do a rundown of 2025, some of our favorite releases, just a casual discussion. We figured we'd kind of wait till January to do it. Just it has nothing to do with the fact that we couldn't get our act together before that, and more to do with the fact that people tend to sort of put out lists mid-December without waiting till the very end of the year to kind of see if anything else comes through, and kind of let some of the releases kind of sit a little bit longer before we actually like make an assessment of what was actually the best of the year. But I think in general, 2025 was actually a pretty good year, particularly for like underground metal. Quite a lot of like old favorites of mine put out material, and I had a few curveball new releases from bands that I was unfamiliar with that I also enjoyed a lot. And my guests have also brought some stuff along as well that I missed, and yeah, I'm very glad they brought it to my attention because there's some good stuff there that even I didn't get to, even though I was desperately scrabbling to cover everything. So yeah, I am joined by the dream team. I have Joseph April on board. Good to have you back, Joseph.
Good to see you, Shelley. Good to see you, everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, and I also have my opposite number in Spain, Belisario of the website El Negro Metal. Good to have you on as well.
Glad to be back. Hello.
Hi, yeah, glad to have you back. And the one and only Tyler as well is joining us.
Thanks for having me back. Glad to be with you all.
Awesome. So we've each picked 3 releases. So actually quite a lot to get through. So we'll just kick off. We'll basically take it in turns and just go around with each one, and I'll just kind of rattle off your picks, but we'll start with mine just because I happen to be talking. And I'm going to start with a band called Cultic and an album called Law. These guys are from Pennsylvania in the US, and they describe their music as dark dungeon metal. And I came across them from their previous release back in 2022 of Fire and Sorcery. And at the time, again, a bit of a curveball. I wasn't really expecting... Well, I don't know what I was expecting when I hit play, but to put it in the simplest terms possible, it's a little bit like if Autopsy played Dungeon Synth. And with this new album, they haven't sort of revamped the formula, they've just expanded it massively and tried to basically do a very kind of narrative concept style album based in kind of high fantasy and dark fantasy, but a real mix of very primitive metal, like very early death metal, a bit of Autopsy, Celtic Frost, Hellhammer, that kind of thing. And some early doom metal as well, mixing it with dungeon synth, either kind of accompanying the metal tracks, or there's lots of interludes, which is sort of, that's where the kind of concept comes in. Each track is kind of bookended by these ambient dungeon synth interludes that kind of weave a thread between each kind of movement, as it were. And I like it just because it's really simple. Like, and me describing it like that, it might even sound a little bit shit, kind of gimmicky. But the formula is really simple. The music itself is really simple as well. But through that, it kind of, they do create quite an expansive cinematic experience that I really enjoy. And yeah, it's a little bit kind of goofy at times. It kind of aesthetically, they lean into the whole kind of camp high theater of like classic heavy metal, but musically I think it's just I don't want to say it's just good fun. It is really good fun, but there's something else to it as well that's just very immersive, much like just reading a really good fantasy novel. So I'll start with Joseph. What were your thoughts on this?
This was an interesting one. You mentioned like the Hellhammer autopsy and everything, and definitely got that feel. It's interesting with the album art because you immediately look at that and, if we lived in the age without the internet and you just had to judge it on a cover, you would think it's power metal or epic doom, maybe. And then you listen to it and you're like, oh, okay, this is a little different. Also, I think some other touch points, like if people were trying to figure out what this band sounds like Winter and Coffins, definitely kind of come up in mind with it. I enjoyed it. I hadn't really heard them much before, so this was kind of like, as soon as you mentioned you were going to pick this band, it's kind of an introduction to me, so I feel like this is one I should go back and listen more to. I think at its best moments, it kind of makes me feel like it's like caveman metal, but on mushrooms. Like there's a weird kind of like distortion of reality feel to it, kind of a drugged out feel, which is enjoyable, actually. Also, it was interesting to note these guys are from York, PA, which is like a 90-minute drive from me. So I might have a chance to see them play at some dungy little bar.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I did wonder when you said, because I think I knew that you were based in Maryland, but yeah, I did wonder if that's kind of relatively nearby. They still seem to be like a very kind of local band in terms of like their reach. Like I just discovered them randomly online. I can't even remember how now, but yeah, I think they're trying to look to kind of expand their audience to a more international kind of stage. But yeah, I think the Winter comparison might be apt as well. Very different vibe to Winter, much more kind of unapologetically like metal, and like you said, leaning into sort of the power metal aesthetic. But yeah, when you put it on, it's dirty and grimy and so on. So yeah, Belisario, what did you make of it?
Well, I have to confess, I didn't like it so much at the beginning. It sounded a bit too derivative, like too stuck with Celtic Frost and Winter on the one side, and then the dungeon synth didn't convince me a lot. But then when I heard it a couple of times more, it began to click in my head, and somehow I think they are really they have their own style. Like it's different from anything else. So in this sense, I came to appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say it's like a grower album because, it's sort of different, but also not in that, I get that it's kind of really obvious where they're drawing influence from, but yeah, you kind of dig into it and you think, oh, they are kind of finding a novel way to find a new angle on what is quite a sort of done style of metal, I suppose. But yeah, Tyler, what did you make of it?
This one was pretty cool. It really reminded me of Cyanide and even a bit of Master personally, although that might just be cross-pollination of influence with groups like Autopsy and Winter. It was a little bit more simplistic, not in riffing style than those bands. I mean, it's hard to argue that something is more simplistic than Cyanide, but maybe a bit in song structure. But I feel like that's partly just the mechanics of the group as well. I mean, they're not just making room for an ultra primitive riffing style. They're also trying to make room for the dungeon synth aesthetic that they are layering over the top of it. But it was a pretty cool listen. I will agree with you that I found the aesthetics verging on the edge of corny, but that also made them kind of charming. It made it kind of charming in some degree as well.
Yeah, charming's definitely the word as well, and it can sometimes sound like you're being what's the word? Can sound detrimental sometimes, but I think that's kind of what they're going for to a certain extent. And you follow them on Instagram, and they do lean into that quite a lot. It's kind of which is quite fun, I think, in quite a traditional way. So yeah, that ranked pretty highly on my list. It was kind of exactly what I wanted from them based on the previous album, just a massive expansion and reaffirmation of what they were already doing. So yeah, if you haven't heard them, highly recommend it. And as Belisario alluded to, it might take a couple of goes before it kind of clicks, but yeah, when it does, it is well worth it. A good mix of kind of high fantasy mixed with really dirty metal. So we'll move on now to Joseph and your first pick. Let's get this one out of the way. Messa, The Spin. Do you want to introduce this one?
Sure. It's kind of funny jumping into this one already. So as anyone who has been following and maybe saw Shelley's recent article, and I'm not going to dive too much into that, but Shelley gave a listen, gave his opinion, and I think we came to kind of different perspectives on this. I mean, the one thing that's accurate is I think this album really was kind of a hyped album for the year. Like, a lot of people got behind it, which honestly, everything from whether Metal Archives or Decibel or other places that really praise this album was kind of a surprise to me, because I remember when, like, probably October, November, wondering who was going to put what as their favorite of the year, trying to look up like Decibel's review for The Spin, and I couldn't find it anywhere, and I thought maybe they hadn't even reviewed it. So when it did show up very high on their list, I was kind of surprised that everyone actually remembered this album when it came out, I think in March or April. Like, I kind of thought it maybe suffered just from not, certain albums getting released a little too late in the year. I mean, too much earlier in the year. But yeah, now what kind of music is it per se? So Messa is an interesting band in that they weren't one that I've loved and followed from the beginning. Their first two albums aren't ones that I particularly have dived into, and really their third album is the first one I really kind of heard, which was 2022's The Close. It's similar to, I guess, like bands like Pallbearer or Windhand. Very kind of, modern type of doom metal. That album, though, was a little bit different in having some sludge and some kind of stoner desert rock influences. You can kind of feel that on the aesthetic of the album cover, kind of an Americana, Native Indian kind of feel to it. But then this album came out and was sort of a new mutation for the band, adding a lot of gothic rock and goth metal kind of influences. And I think if anyone's been listening to these and remembers me gushing over the Last Tribulation album and talking about other stuff, I'm a huge fan of that type of music. So this very much fits in that. But at the same time, for me, it just kind of hit it out of the ballpark so well because it just recalled back to a lot of the 90s classics that I love. Paradise Lost, Icon, Draconian Times era, Tiamat around the time of Wild Honey. And the big one, especially because of singer Sarah's vocals, which I think even compared listening back to older albums, she's extremely confident in this album. She's not really holding back. She's very sure of herself in singing, which I think is just reflected in the quality of the album, but really recalls The Gathering with their breakout album, Mandolin. But, if one isn't terribly familiar with that era of bands and that sound, another way to compare it is they definitely pulled influences from actual post-punk and goth bands like Killing Joke, especially around Nighttime, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns era, Susie and the Banshees, Juju. It kind of combined that with 70s, 80s doom metal, Black Sabbath, especially Sabbath's jazzy moments, because there's definitely, you can tell the guitarist definitely has a bit of a jazz background, along with something a little more muscular like Trouble or Saint Vitus. And yeah, just kind of hits all the little dots that I love in terms of doom metal and gothic metal, and especially that peak 90s sound. So yeah, that's why it was one of my favorites.
Cool. Apologies, I dipped out for a second. I was just fixing my connection. So yeah, I caught the last bit of what you were saying there. Just to sort of clarify, I did really like the album in and of itself. Like, it, as you were saying, it ticked a lot of boxes for me in terms of like, yeah, I really liked the gothic elements to it. Bit of Fields and the Nephilim in there as well. I think the actual metal bits were well done, and I think integrating that into the proggy stuff as well, they do a far better job of combining all those elements than a lot of like comparable modern bands do. And I think as well, maybe like in the early 2010s when I was trying to make an effort with doom metal, contemporary doom metal, sort of, stoner adjacent stuff, but also that kind of bleeds into post metal as well, because it was very on trend at the time, and there was a lot of local bands doing something similar. I think this album, if it was released back then, it would have really kind of chimed with me. But I find it interesting that it chimed so much with a metal crowd, a specific type of metal crowd, aka the kind that hang out on Metal Archives. And part of what I was pointing out was like there was a long debate on the forum about how the album reached the top spot, mostly just arguing about genre and stuff, but also saying that like, Metal Archives considers itself to be quite elite. Whether it is or not anymore is a different matter. Or not elite, sorry, like quite purist, quite a sort of rigid definition of what metal is. And there's the debate around how this album kind of came out on top. But also thinking about it, there's plenty of other examples of non-metal bands that resonate specifically with a particular type of metal audience. The sort of Wardruna kind of adjacent stuff. Can dance, stuff like that. So I'm not saying that they're anything like this. They clearly do have metal elements to them, but it's just, I think I find the debate around it kind of more interesting than the album itself. Although the album is, it's good, it's really well done. But yeah, it's just not it's not the kind of thing that I go for these days, because I guess like if I want to hear prog rock, I'll listen to prog rock, and if I want to hear goth, I'll listen to goth, and if I want to hear metal, I'll listen to metal. But
yeah, I think the one thing with it is that I feel like goth metal, like there's certain albums, especially from the 90s, that I feel like are real highlights, but a lot of the genre is very derivative. Like a lot of stuff where it feels like it just is taking influence from Paradise Lost, not from any of the influences Paradise Lost took from. It can get really kind of muddled, and then bands that just sound like a metal backdrop to late Sisters of Mercy, I feel like that sound has been done to death. So for me, when something like this comes out, and to me it just feels more genuine, and probably because of picking similar influences from the 80s rather than just looking at the 90s, or even worse, even later, it has that feel of something, again, like The Gathering at their best, something coming out in that 90s era.
Yeah, I think the word is probably authentic. And yeah, like I said, it flows a lot better than comparable albums that are trying to do something similar. And yeah, I take the Gathering point, definitely. Quite like understated and subtle in the way it goes about it as well, and it has a sort of very good atmosphere on top of like just the performances themselves, which I think really does kind of elevate it. But yeah, the jury's out as to whether it well, I don't want to say whether it deserved the attention. It obviously resonated with people a lot, and who am I to kind of judge it despite what I might say. But yeah, it's interesting that it resonated so much with a certain crowd. So, Tyler, did you get a chance to listen to this?
I did, and first of all, I must be living under a rock because it sounds like there's some mild controversy surrounding this album on the one hand, and on the other hand, it generated a lot of, as you put it, hype. But it sounds like that to me only through what you and Joseph have said about it. Prior to the two of you bringing it up in the context of doing this episode and speaking about it, I had literally never heard of this album before.
So,
Not even once.
In the poll on Metal Archives for top albums of 2025, this album came top in a weighted poll where everyone sort of does their rankings and stuff. And there was a very heated, long forum debate about how this album made it to the top on Metal Archives, which, like I said, considers itself to be kind of quite purist in its definition of metal, I guess.
See, and that frustrates me slightly because I saw you two discussing that, and a group that has at least a somewhat similar approach that I like to some degree is called Crone Visions. Have any of you heard of them?
No, I haven't, no.
I don't think I have.
They're a doom metal group that incorporates gothic rock influences, and I quite like them quite a bit. Not featured on Metal Archives, and as you all may know, I know that sometimes they're not featured simply because no one bothered to put them up there, but they have a following, and I know that a lot of the time when something isn't featured on Metal Archives, it's because Metal Archives deemed them not quite meeting the definition of metal. But listening to this, I thought, well, why is this not only featured on Metal Archives, but being given top ratings by them in a poll, and yet Crone Visions doesn't even have a page on the website, you know? But that being said, I don't want to just state the obvious because everyone knows what I'm going to say about this album. It's not my cup of tea. But it was interesting listening to it because I had no expectations going in. I only had a vague idea of what it was supposed to sound like. And the most vague idea, I don't even think I read you two mentioning its gothic influences. And I had just combed through the discography of a goth rock group or one of those goth adjacent genres from France called Soror Dolorosa. And so just coming fresh off of listening to all of their albums, they have like 4 or 5, I turned this on and thought, oh, this isn't metal. This is a goth rock band. And then listened to it a little more and I said, oh, okay, I can hear some of the doom metal influences and some of the metal influences and riffing. But yeah, it wasn't bad. A lot of the times when an album gets the kind of hype that at least you made it out to have, it's doing something that's pretty superficial but novel. And that usually infuriates me, honestly, to some degree or another. This didn't quite meet that level, but it didn't do anything that I'm trying to think of how to put this without sounding vague and ambiguous. It didn't do anything that made it stand out to me above the myriad other groups that approach this style that have already been brought up by Joseph, like Tiamat or Paradise Lost's Gothic era. So while I suppose I understood why it raised some interest among people, especially with some of the kind of prog rock / jazz influences, Sensu, Black Sabbath, that you could hear at parts of it, which I think they integrated fairly seamlessly. Credit to them for that. It's not something that I personally am ever going to reach for, given the kind of tastes that I have in metal music.
Yeah, just on that as well. I remember there was a local band in the UK that did a very similar sound. They're sadly not around anymore, called Sometime the Wolf. And I actually tried to add them to Metal Archives as well, and they were denied because the moderator said it was a rock band. And I was like, looking back, I was like, if anything, they had more metal riffs than this Messa album. But we could debate all day around kind of the weird rules that Metal Archives has as to who it allows in and who it kind of blocks. And sometimes they put like a really salty caveat, like they do on the Def Leppard page. If you ever go on there, there's like a caveat of like they're only allowed in because of the debut album. It's like you don't really need to kind of specify that. I think people know who Def Leppard are, but anyway. Yeah,
It probably doesn't hurt that they got signed by Metal Blade for that album, so
that
it might
too,
be
yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, yeah, and I was also thinking there's plenty of artists that sort of move in the metal orbit that aren't really metal in the strictest sense of the term, but I can see why they resonate with a metal audience. I'm thinking sort of more like post metal stuff, some of the more experimental, kind of industrial ambient stuff, or bands that just evolve out of metal, like Ulver or Paradise Lost. For a time, they stopped playing metal. So yeah, I could definitely see why, but yeah, there is a question mark as to why it reached the top spot. But I guess it is just kind of, it ticked all those boxes for a lot of people of kind of what they were looking for, and they just did it far better than a lot of people. But anyway, sorry, Belisario, do you have any thoughts on this album?
Oh, I'm happy Tyler spoke before me, so this way I'm not the only antagonist to this album. I didn't like it too much. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a bad album, but the first half of it sounds a lot like old post-punk. The second half of it is more rock, heavy metal, which I don't know why an album should sound like two different halves. It was a bit confusing for me. But then I wouldn't say it's not a metal album like 100%, because I guess in the all heavy metal influences you can hear there is a justification to label this as heavy metal. But I have my own theory as to why this one was so up in the chart for Metal Archives, because I have the impression that maybe many metalheads are not so familiar with post-punk bands or Killing Joke or this kind of stuff. So when they hear this, it sounds really fresh and new for them, especially when it's mixed with a bit of heavy metal. So I guess it's kind of a newer thing for them, and they genuinely like it, which is not my case because I'm already familiar with this stuff. And it brought to mind, when I was listening to this album, a phenomenon which happened 15 years ago, approximately. I thought about quite a lot, because if you remember a band called The Devil's Blood from the Netherlands, which was pretty popular around 2010, and it was 70s rock heavy metal, like rehashed, quite derivative, so to speak, well done, but really stuck with this decade, with the 70s. And at that time, I remember all metalheads were going nuts with this because they loved it, and it was really, really a big hype at the time. And I could understand it because I think many people, many younger metalheads were not familiar with this kind of music, but myself also, I confess. But then this was a hype for some time, and then this band is pretty much forgotten, I should say. And this, remember how big it was at the time, it's kind of strange that it has faded so much.
Well, I mean, you're right that the early 2010s, like 70s sounds and the idea of like bands that were kind of a little hidden in the 70s. I mean, I think, you can even look at Pentagram, like who are a pretty foundational metal band, but were very much, you had to be in the know to know about them. And especially like the 70s recordings. Then all of a sudden, the late 2000s, Relapse re-releasing that stuff. So 2010s, I think that's true. Like 70s proto-metal really took a big interest. And just to defend the Devil's Blood very briefly, a part of their dropping away is because their main guitarist died, committed suicide. So that was a major reason why that band has kind of drifted away.
Right, but yeah,
True.
I get that's really tragic, actually, and I would, my condolences to his friends and family. But that '70s sound was kind of a trend that overall it's not entirely disappeared. There's obviously still its fans, but it doesn't have as much of the attention as it did at its peak, which was like, yeah, probably about approximately 15 years ago in like the 2010s or so. And there's been a few other trends since then, probably the most recent one in memory being that old school death metal revival, which is also kind of like not entirely disappeared, but is kind of losing steam currently.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think I was just going to say, as a subject for an episode, we could talk about sort of the waves of nostalgia that have at different times hit the metal scene. And yeah, I think in the 2010s, that 70s nostalgia, proto-metal nostalgia, like, I mean, hell, at that time, I discovered that 70s Scorpions was not 80s Scorpions and kind of became obsessed with that, all thanks to Fenriz. I mean, and that's another thing. I think people like Fenriz and stuff, people like that really just started gushing about a lot of stuff from the 70s. So it had a moment where people really got hyped on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, not to spend too long on this album because we've got a lot to get through, but just coming off what Belisario said, I think what's happening is we're old enough now that we're seeing like waves of trends where kids, younger people rediscover sounds that, were being rediscovered, as it were. So yeah, the early 2010s, I mean, there were a lot of bands locally that were doing that 70s sound, but yeah, I know like internationally it was a big trend, but that was like 15 years ago. So it's long enough ago that there's a new generation coming up who are again rediscovering it, and an album like Messa to them probably sounds insanely fresh, and it's making them go back and discover not just classic metal, but maybe a bit of prog, and as you mentioned as well, post-punk. But it sounds fresh to them because they haven't heard it before. But for us, it's like, oh, this has all happened before. But, it was quite a long time ago now, like the 2010s. Like, we are getting that bit older. But yeah, and again, in the early 2010s, there would have been loads of people that, were around for that original wave, being like, this is a trend in itself. But as you said, nostalgia comes in cycles. So yeah, maybe that does in part explain why it resonated so much. But not to disparage the album. It's a very good album. It's a very good version of what it is, and I can at least respect it for that. I'm more fascinated by the discourse around it. But any other thoughts on Messa before we move on? No. Okay. So Belisario, we'll do your first pick next, and I've got Mouth of Madness, Event Horizon.
This is a song about the greatest example strength of the universe. Impalement, decay, evolution. Evolution to the intestines.
From Germany. Do you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, it's I got familiar with it from a review you did, a short review, and it's really not famous at all, I would say. I haven't seen this album discussed pretty much anywhere, and it struck me because it's quite modest in its presentation. The album cover is horrible, actually. It's one of the things I don't like from it. So I guess it may maybe put people off it. But the music, it's really worthy, I would say. It's kind of, for me, the dark horse of this year, because it's a style of, I would say, black thrash. It would be the best way to label it. And with really simple formula. And in songs that are quite short, but they reach for a really ambitious result, and it's pretty impressive to see how these people are able to do something that sounds really majestic with pretty basic elements. So that is the thing I found them the best from this album. It's a duo from Germany, and this is the debut album, so it's quite impressive for a first attempt.
Yeah, I do remember viewing it. With hindsight, I probably should have done a slightly longer review. I think I kind of maybe prejudged it from the album cover as well, because it does look like a typical kind of modern avant-garde metal album cover of a band trying to be quirky. But you listen to it, and it is a quirky album. I will say that up front. Yes, it is kind of, a lot of the riffs are very traditional, straight edge, like Black and Thrash. So there's a little bit like Merciless in there and things like that. But it's odd, but in a very kind of understated, subtle way. Very kind of energetic. There's lots of different ideas thrown in there, but it kind of comes together at the end, and they almost sort of make you sort of they strain your sense of credulity at times, but they kind of always bring it around to something that kind of makes sense. Borrowing from things like Sarcophago and Profanatica, but bringing it into quite a sort of almost technical adjacent place. It's very kind of what's the word, busy and frantic, as well as being quite kind of rudimentary and kind of raw in its presentation. And the other thing I like about it as well is it's a short album, but it's broken up by these like dark ambient interludes that in another context I might have found annoying because it breaks the flow, but I quite like the juxtaposition of this very kind of raw, immediate performance that feels very just organic, almost like you're listening to them in the rehearsal room, juxtaposed with this quite like expansive soundscapes that sort of break up the album a little bit, and they kind of give it this very otherworldly atmosphere, which I guess is kind of fitting for the name of the band and the album as well. So yeah, a good pick, and I'm glad I revisited this one. Tyler, did you get a chance to listen to this one?
I did, and you had about the same experience I did upon opening this up to listen to it for the first time. I thought, oh no, this is going to be one of those highly conceptualized, highly artificed, dissonant death or black metal albums that meander into places where I forget where the song is and I'm not able to differentiate between one track and the next, and this is going to be a slog. Man, was I pleasantly surprised. It was not that pretty much at all. Was there some weirdness to it? Yes, but first song proper anyway, kicks in with some Hellhammer style riffing, and then into some more traditional kind of first wave black metal style riffs. You brought up Merciless and Sarcophago, and I thought this is actually pretty cool. This is a pretty decent album. This is probably, out of the picks for this episode, one of the ones that I liked more. I don't have too much of a detailed analysis of it, but it was pretty good. Mostly my reaction was just defined by being surprised that it didn't sound like what the album cover led me to believe it would.
It's funny that, try and think of myself as above all of that, but yeah, I really did prejudge it based on that, because your description of the kind of album that it looks like it sounds like, so many albums that I kind of sit through that sound like that, and I think points for just not doing that. But I think once you get over that little surprise, it's a quirky little release, and it's early days for these guys, so I would say keep an eye on them, because they've definitely kind of cornered quite a unique sound. Joseph, do you have thoughts on this?
It's I'm sure we're not all going to be opposite of each other throughout this, but this was probably one of the more difficult albums for me to get through, which is a little ironic since it's not exactly a long album. My read on it musically was that it's sort of a progressive, a bit avant-garde kind of take on black thrash. Just rhythmically and things that are happening in it was kind of hard for me to really nod my head along to, or kind of get into the groove with it. At the same time, I kept on feeling like it was kind of as progressively feeling as black thrash as it was. It did kind of feel like, I don't know, like added elements would maybe make it something that I suddenly would have clicked with, like if there were keyboards prominent on it or something like that. But just as it is, I had kind of a hard time with it. Now, maybe I just need to give it 3 more front to back listens and it'll click. But as it is so far, this is probably an album I'm least inclined to go back to.
That's fine. We value dissenting opinion. That's why we have you on, Joseph. It's okay to be wrong. No, but I do agree. It's like it is an odd album, so I guess you kind of like it took me a few goes to get my head into it, and like I said, with hindsight, I should have given it a longer review, and at the time I didn't. So obviously I didn't kind of click with it as much as I'm saying I did now, because yeah, I'm just I'm glad Belisario picked it, because it's given me the chance to revisit it, and yeah, and yeah, it's sort of what's the word? Production wise, it feels more like something that's trying to be understated old school death metal, but then you listen to the riffs and they're more thrashy, and then yes, some sort of proto black metal stuff with a sort of slice of kind of weirdness, for want of a better word, but not kind of contrived or forced down your throat or anything. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see where these guys go, because there's a lot going on there, and just keep an eye on them, I suppose. Cool. So moving on, Tyler, we'll go for your first pick, which I have down as Dissidence, our first of two Colombian bands today. Seven Crosses Impaled. Do you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. This was probably a heavy contender for me for album of the year, up there with Kæck's, I'm going to butcher the name, Gruwelijk Onthaal. I really liked how this album retained everything that I enjoy about the classic period of death metal without simply rehashing the aesthetic like most of the old school death metal revival that I brought up a bit ago. It really had a kind of focus on the interplay between riffs, and that was pretty much the only focus. It didn't really try to emphasize anything novel aesthetically, or kind of try to justify itself with a focus on alternate instrumentation or use of tones that were non-normative for death metal riffing. It's just a ripping album. I think that it's kind of an interesting fusion, at least partly. It's not really a major emphasis of the album, between the Swedish style of death metal and a bit of the kind of South American style that you hear in groups like Crisian. And that kind of gives it a really great meeting place between that old school kind of narrative horror movie evil of Swedish death metal and that kind of ripping blasphemy of groups like Crisian that I mentioned. This was overall just really cool. I listened to it in my car probably more times than I can count.
Well, yeah, to my shame, before you brought it to my attention, it passed me by. But yeah, I can see why you picked it. I'll keep banging my South American metal, particularly thrash and death metal drum again. They just something going on down there where they take very well established styles and just make them sound fresh again. They don't do anything revolutionary particularly, or just completely tear apart the formula. They just take the particular versions of death metal and thrash and just kind of completely refresh them. And this is a really good example of that. For my money, a couple of years ago, we spoke about a band called Moral Putrefaction from India, who, good as they were, they basically, the whole album, it was a self-titled album. It sounded like pure immolation worship, which was good, but I would like to see more from them. The Dissidence, by contrast, felt like the immolation album that should have followed, something like Unholy Cult. It sounds like modern immolation done right. And yeah, there's good things about modern immolation. It's not all bad, but I do feel like they sort of started falling off a cliff after Majesty and Decay in particular. And this album is kind of what I wished they would do. I do hear a lot of immolation in there, but kind of with a thrashier, more direct approach. I think that's probably the Swedish element you were talking about as well, in terms of being a bit more linear, whereas immolation tend to be a bit more like disruptive and three-dimensional. But there's definitely a lot of what you, Tyler, described once as tugging rhythms, which is very good kind of description of the way their music flows. And I hear a lot of that in the Dissidence, but also like, yes, some more straightforward, like primitive stuff going on. And yeah, the vocals as well. Initially, I sort of found it annoying because they do sound like a lot of sort of run-of-the-mill old-school death metal bands trying to sound like Craig Pillard or something. But once you kind of literally get into the groove of the music, you find they do fit really well and just really flesh out the experience. So yeah, just a really solid, refreshing death metal pick. So yeah, Belisario, I think you said you were already familiar with this one. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was a bit surprised to see this one picked because I thought it was much more unknown, and I was familiar with it already since one of my readers spoke to me about it and recommended it, and he's also a reader of your site. So hi, Belano, if you're listening to this, and. He said it was one of the best albums of the year for him, and is quite. I agree with you that it's quite a kind of a modest formula, because it's not groundbreaking or it doesn't really pretend to be anything really new, but it's quite good in its way to mix what I hear as South American death metal style, like a band like Mortem from Peru, like. Kind of warm sounding, but also powerful. And there is also an influence from Swedish death metal, but not directly. I would say there is more like a Swedish interpretation of the Swedish style through a band which adds a bit more of a harsh power, like Flesh Crawl, for example. This is where I hear, and in this sense, it's really it's a different formula as one is used to listen to, and it really works. Really, I wouldn't say original, but they found their own style. And we're talking about the band that is pretty new. I think it's a debut album, so. They have a future ahead, I guess. And also, I would like to mention that they are from the city of Medellin in Colombia, which is a place where many of the most important and also original bands from Colombia come from. So it's kind of a hot spot for a good stuff usually in Colombia.
Interesting. Yeah. I was looking a little bit, checking them out on Metal Archives, and yeah, they do seem. Like they're pretty young as well. So, promising stuff. Joseph, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I mean, truth is, a lot of you guys' picks were pretty new to me. There's a few that I knew before. So this one definitely was, I mean, given that they're a young band and from South America, I'm not familiar with it all before. And that's partially my fault in that South America is usually kind of a bit of a blind spot outside of the Brazilian scene, and sometimes friends mentioning bands from Chile and Argentina. But yeah, I thought it was enjoyable. It's kind of an album I'd have to kind of listen to much more to kind of get a real feel for it. You guys mentioned the Swedish influence, but I kind of felt like without listen to anyone's opinions or finding any references, I was thinking of Finnish death metal, especially with some of the harmonies that were being used. Kind of brought that to mind, but at the same time kind of mashed up with like non-Floridian American death metal. That was something that kind of kept on gravitating to that dynamic of coming back and forth between those two. It was good. It'd be very interesting to see if they kind of take even bolder steps going forward, because certainly it'd be interesting to see the South American scene get a bigger profile in the world.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'll keep banging that drum on my own tiny little drum that I have. But yeah, definitely sort of very representative of that region, but also, yeah, its own little thing. So, yeah, cool pick. Thanks for that, Tyler. Right, that is round one done. We're moving on. Got a lot to get through. So my next pick is a Ukrainian death metal band. We've got a lot of death metal going on here. Called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciations, but Heruvim, and the album is Mercator. And again, this was another curveball release. Unlike the Cultic, I wasn't familiar with these guys before last year. This is their debut album, another pretty young band by the looks of it as well. And I was going back over my review of it at the time, which I think was late summer, early autumn. And I kept making Demolik comparisons, which I still think is valid. There's a bit of that going on in their sound, but it is actually much less abstract, I should say, in the way it presents itself. It is trying to be capital W weird death metal, but it's a bit more traditionally like gothic, and I guess you could equate it to more like Northern European death metal, in that it has that sense of like dark romanticism mixed with quite sort of direct thrashing and heavy metal derived riffs. But there's a little bit of Finnish weirdness going on as well. The kind of abstract, surrealist weirdness of the Finnish style, but it's kind of mixed together in this churn. And it's also quite the flow of this album is a little bit unusual for death metal, in that they do indulge in some doomier passages, but they also kind of sometimes completely kind of sabotage the momentum of the album with these very like lingering dark ambient passages that sort of seem to almost kill a track before it's properly developed, which, you know, you could be liable to find it frustrating, but I sort of find it just interesting. It sort of seems like they're putting up barriers and challenging themselves to twist the music around these contours and sort of peaks and troughs, and try and make death metal a bit more dynamic in the sense of, in the literal music theory use of the term, in terms of using volume as a kind of compositional tool, which I just found very interesting. So yeah, another kind of young band, first album, so it'd be interesting to see where they go. I should also mention all of their lyrics are based on the Conan the Barbarian universe, so it's all based around all that kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say dark fantasy, but early fantasy, quite kind of preoccupied with narrative in that sense, but also it's an interesting medium to use that because it is still quite quirky death metal, and you'd normally associate that kind of style again with maybe more traditional speed metal or power metal and so on. So yeah, what I found was quite an interesting album. I'll go around in reverse order now. So Joseph, I'll call on you first.
This is an interesting band. I saw someone mention as a reference point Pestilence for them, and that kind of felt right, but at the same time definitely pulling bits and pieces from other different scenes, certainly. The thing that caught me most, I found enjoyable. I'm not sure how much of it is an album I keep on coming back to, but then again, maybe, another listen, things would click even more. But their background and themes are really interesting. Again, like if you tell me, death metal band from Ukraine, and then you show me the album cover art and the lyrics, and it's like, it's all Conan the Barbarian and Robert E. Howard stories, I'd be like, that's a curveball. Not something I would expect. And at the same time, like reading up a bit on the band, they definitely in press for the band and while on tour, it seems like they definitely talk about the fact that they're a Ukrainian band and that the recording of this album was very much impacted by the war. So it's a very interesting, like compared to like 1914 or some other bands, or even, you know, things like Trudka, or, you know, where the kind of, you can feel like the impact of the war and the music kind of reflecting that, instead going in a very fantasy route, but they do not shy about the fact that, you know, the real world events impacting them. And one final thing that I think was in the Bandcamp write-up for the album that they mentioned as a big influence that really, I mean, I admire it, but it's really weird that they mentioned that this album was highly influenced by David Lynch, who, of course, passed away last year. But again, Conan the Barbarian, death metal from Ukraine, and then saying David Lynch was a big influence, it just makes me very curious.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot going on there. I do remember the press release not pulling any punches in terms of referencing the war and the political situation there, but also, yeah, it is interesting that they just, in the music itself, it is just completely fantasy based. And I guess, I don't know if they came up with that concept before the war and just, you know, very deeply invested in it, or if it's sort of a form of escapism. But the David Lynch thing is interesting as well. I actually missed that, but now you mention it, there is an element of surrealism to the music, which sort of feels more closely aligned with his work than it does with anything that's just sort of sword and sorcery kind of fantasy stuff. But yeah.
It struck me as really weird, and again, I think it probably just reflects how personal David Lynch's art can be for people, and so that must have stuck with them. And then, you know, I don't know when this was recorded, around the time Lynch died, so maybe that had an impact. But
yeah,
it's just weird because, like, it's not like Lynch did movies about war or like kind of the extreme human conditions, which often become, you know, focus for metal bands, whereas, you know, Lynch's focus really was sort of the darkness and humanity lurking behind the mundane and the normal.
Yeah. It's interesting. Tyler, what were your thoughts on it?
So you said this album was influenced by Robert E. Howard?
Yeah, like all the concept is all based on that.
Oh man, I was dead wrong. I thought it was influenced by He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Like you had Mercator, Skeletor, big skeleton man, little muscly guy with a sword.
Yeah, you just ruined the album cover for me.
All joking aside, it's weird because this album has probably everything that on a checklist. If someone were to compose a checklist, what does Tyler look for in a death metal band? I think this band probably has all of those things, but it didn't click with me. There were parts that sounded a lot like Immolation, actually, to me. Suffocation, maybe a bit of like Death and Autopsy as well, although that's also kind of just a cross-influence thing. It definitely reached for weird. I didn't really hear Demi-Leech in it, although since you brought them up, I can hear what you were talking about, what you were kind of relating to Demi-Leech style riffing. But at the same time, it felt like a really good exercise in interesting ways to put together riffs, but the songs didn't really reach a gestalt for me, where it felt like there was an overall experience being gestured at with the music. And that sounds really pompous, and I'm sorry for that to all the listeners, but that's honestly, I think, probably the clearest assessment of why I didn't really lock in while listening to this album, as the young people put it. But it was good. It wasn't bad in the sense of me listening to an album and being outright offended by it. It's a decent death metal album. It just wasn't my cup of tea.
Yeah, no, I know we talk about this a lot, and yeah, I guess you could, from one angle, say it sounds a little bit disconnected. If you're being trying to find a way that doesn't sound like I'm just insulting you, but not being a perfectionist about it. But yeah, there's lots of unique elements. For me, it kind of came together because I feel like it was disconnected in the right way, and that it was quite deliberate as a compositional tool, and it's non-traditional in the way it flows like a death metal album, which felt intentional. And the difference between that and a lot of modern death metal bands that don't reach that gestalt, as you often refer to it as, it feels more like accidental and that they can't do it. But yeah, for me it was these guys. It felt like they were sort of deliberately being a bit left field. But yeah, Belisari, what were your thoughts?
Oh, I have to disagree with Tyler. I like this one very much, and I got to know it through your review, I think. I haven't seen this one talked about anywhere else, and I found it really good. Like, it's pretty original, because you don't hear so many bands with Demolish influence, especially in the riffs and the rhythms, maybe not so much the structure. And it's mixed with something like more melodic death metal, but not in a bad way. Because usually when I hear melodic death metal, I used to frown, and it's not a good thing. But in this case, they managed not to water it down or to make it more mellow, but it becomes more melancholic, and it really they managed to make the different influences match together, in my opinion. So it works quite well, and it was a really refreshing entry, I would say.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, definitely, like I said, curveball release. I've not seen anyone else covering it, so yeah, check it out if you haven't heard it. Right, Joseph, on to your next pick, which is Morax, the Amulet. Norwegian heavy metal, I believe.
Yep. I think I forget where in Norway. I think it might be based in Bergen, so the west coast. This is probably I'm forgetting if it. No, I don't think anyone's had like a straight up kind of like heavy metal album, so this might be the one album like that. Very 80s, reference points to Merciful Fates, not so much the vocals, does not have a King Diamond type of vocal approach, but definitely the riff writing of Fate, definitely comparisons, I think, to Solitude, who are one of my favorite bands of, the past 2 decades. And since that band ended, felt like far too short. Usually anyone who kind of taps into that is just giving me instant dopamine. I think another reference point that doesn't get mentioned, though, is Angel Witch. I feel a lot of Angel Witch in this band. Also, maybe some things like Sortilege, 1970s Judas Priest. The album cover even gives a bit of a Sin After Sin vibe. I was first familiar with this band. They had a debut EP in 2023 that Fenriz name dropped, and again, as soon as I heard it, it very much fit a lot of those traditional 80s heavy metal and new wave of British heavy metal isms that I really enjoy. And then 2 years later, this came out. I think if you like that kind of stuff, you like the things Fenriz name drops, you enjoy 80s metal that clearly knows its roots and stuff like Uli Jon Roth, Scorpions, like just someone who's listening to Sales or Sharon as they're nodding off to sleep. I think another reference point for people to slide into this is the main guy, Remy, who I think writes pretty much everything. He's also in the Norwegian black thrash band Cultic, who I actually got to see when I went to Norway for the first time back in 2016. he's been in that band, and they've been around for about a decade. And it's very much like, imagine that sound and probably other Norwegian black thrash influence like Aurora Nor and Deathhammer, but funneling that straight into like late 70s Judas Priest and new wave of British heavy metal. And then you get Morax, pretty much.
Yeah, like a really solid, knowledgeable rendition of that era. Definitely agree with like the early new album reference points. I think I heard a few riffs that reminded me of like Dio era Sabbath as well. And the vocals, yeah, you kind of alluded to the fact they're not King Diamond. They kind of reminded me of Tom G Warrior circa Cold Lake, but the kind of sound that I think Tom G Warrior is trying to do and just kind of couldn't really emulate at all. These vocals aren't bad by any measure, but they are a bit rough around the edges, but I think that kind of lends it a charm that
yeah, it has a little bit of a like Algae from Tank or Paul Di'Anno, like a little rougher quality that you would hear in some new wave of British heavy metal.
Yeah, like the earlier sound, like early. So you mentioned like 70s Priest, Angel Witch, the sort of rougher start of heavy metal when it was still a bit raw and DIY. I think obviously heavy metal went for a period of being very slick and very sort of orchestrated and theatrical, and people kind of grew tired with that. Now it's become its own retro thing in its own right, and some people are trying to reach back for a more authentic take on it, and I think this is a really good example of that. But it doesn't feel contrived. It doesn't feel like it's pastiche too much. I mean, obviously anyone familiar with that era and will get all the reference points and so on, but it doesn't feel cheap in any way. It's more kind of a love letter to that era, but a very well done one. It kind of all comes together quite nicely. Belisario, what did you make of it? Is this are you into heavy metal at all, or?
Yes, it's maybe not the thing I listen to the most, but I'm open to suggestions. And this one was interesting. I heard a lot of Angel Witch, as Joseph said, really a lot, starting by the voice, but also the way of how the songs are done. And it was pretty good, but I think it suffers a bit from it being a one-man band project, because I guess maybe for black metal, since it is more basic, it works well. But in heavy metal, I think you miss some kind of second guitarist or some more proficient musician to do the leads, or to give something and make it more a band thing, because I think it suffers a bit from this.
That's interesting. I didn't really clock that in terms of, I knew it was like a one-man operation, but I didn't feel like it was detrimental to the sound. But now you mention it, yeah, there wasn't. It was very like riff focused, and a lot of the riffs did stand out. But it wasn't such a sort of virtuoso. There wasn't so many sort of spotlights on different instruments as you tend to get in heavy metal, but. To some extent, I think that is also the fact that it is referencing kind of an earlier permutation of the style when it was slightly less about virtuosity and more about just the excitement of what was at the time quite a new style. And it's interesting that it's coming from this sort of younger act. And I know there's a lot of young heavy metal acts these days, but they do often sound, like I said, they're either too polished or they're being too obvious about the fact that they're trying to kind of be sort of retro and sort of emulate this style. But Tyler, what were your thoughts?
This is a solid traditional heavy metal album. I really recently listened to a group called Venator that is in a similar style I really liked, and I'd say it's kind of along those lines. A lot of the kind of new wave of traditional heavy metal albums to me sound almost more like, this is going to be a bold claim, punk albums than traditional heavy metal albums. Sometimes even kind of verging where I'm like, is that a Blink-182 riff I just heard? But with more chugging. And this band did not fall into that trap whatsoever. I don't feel like they had as much of that kind of wistful, nostalgic mood that Venator has that just kind of tickles my sweet tooth when it comes to this particular style, because I mean, the thing with this style is it's a really sentimental a lot of the times at its best, and that kind of like limits its listening to me to when I'm just kind of engaging in, I guess, what you can call emotional maintenance, which is cool, good, has its place. But yeah, I didn't hear as much of a variance, and not quite on that same level as the albums by Venator that I liked. But it is solid, and it doesn't sound like cashing in on simply an aesthetic niche or even a trend, which the new wave of traditional heavy metal kind of was for a time. It's actually a pretty solid homage to groups like Merciful Fate, I definitely heard in there, and Angel Witch quite a bit too. I heard that myself, so I would be shocked if that wasn't a conscious influence on the band.
Yeah, it's a difference between a pastiche and a love letter, I think. This one is, yeah, if you like that style, you'll get a lot from this. But
yeah, one final note on it. I think a lot of, as much as I do like a lot of bands in this style and more traditional, often they get ruined by vocalists who are very preening and very, like, for some reason, just when they go for the high pitched vocals, it's aggravating in a way that I don't think of with Bruce Dickinson or Rob Halford, but like, there's a preeniness to it, and him going for more of an Angel Witch, Paul Di'Anno, tank kind of vocal performance avoids that, and I think it works better.
Yeah, definitely. Like the crooner thing, at the time, there was literally a handful of vocalists that could do that. I mean, you listen to sort of Angel Witch, Satan, that kind of thing. The vocals were a bit rough around the edges, and yeah, again, that lent it its kind of raw immediacy at the time that kind of sets early heavy metal apart from what it became in the mid '80s when. Vocalists, there was this expectation that they would be a bit more like operatic in that sense, and that is the sound that people go for now. And I guess that's just musicians these days are much more technically proficient, and vocalists as well. But if you're going for this sound and you are basically trying to emulate a particular era, it's important to sort of think about not overwhelming the music with a very kind of bolshy vocal performance, because you're thinking, oh, heavy metal equals the high pitched wails and so on. Actually, a lot of bands didn't really do that at the time. They were going for a bit more of a street level kind of immediacy to it. But yeah, solid pick. Much less controversial than your first pick. So Belisario, your next pick is Necromaniac. Do you want to introduce this one?
Yes, it's a band from London, but none of its members are English. It's kind of a melting pot, actually. And actually, the guitarist, I got to speak with him because he's Spanish. He's not famous from any other band, but he's got this project for a long time. And it's quite an interesting pick for me, and I wanted to put it forward here because I've listened to. I think it didn't impact so much as it deserves, on the one hand, and on the other, I've seen it a bit criticized because some people thought about it as kind of a retro act or a retro sound, which in part it is. I think I can understand this criticism because it sounds really old, like from the 80s, dark sound, like proto black metal. But in its defense, I would say that it doesn't copy any particular band, which is usually the flaw with retro acts. And instead, it tries to use older influences or older elements and to build a new language with them, so to speak. So you can hear in them some European proto-black and some Slayer and many different bands put together. So it sounds a bit like a mishmash, but at the same time it's an original thing, so to speak, like a kind of collage. And in this way, you can find it a bit retro, actually, yeah. I can understand that, but it's a different thing on its own. So I would say it's like old-styled metal. And for this album, the best thing about it, I could say, is that it's really well done. Like, all the songs are really thought out, and all the details are where they should be. And it's a really pleasant and rewarding listening experience. So I would recommend this one to anyone who likes old-style black metal in general, because it's really great.
Yeah, you basically took the words out my mouth then. I was going to say, like, you put it on and you think, this is just like an emulation of very early black metal, still a bit of thrash going on. Yeah, late 80s, with a very kind of occult vibe. But then you listen to the album in its full, and it is pushing 50 minutes. It's not a short album, and it's using that style, that genre, those as raw materials, but it is building its own kind of compositional language from that. So, like, on the face of it, it sounds retro, but when you dig into it and go into the architecture of the album, it's very well developed and has its own identity, and very kind of what's the word, rich, in the way that it's told. You can hear all the reference points, but it's not derivative of any one specific artist, because they are using those building blocks to kind of create their own story from it. And what else was I going to say about it? Oh yeah, I didn't clock that. Yeah, I had the guy from Macabre Omen, the Greek black metal band. I think he's been in a couple of other projects as well. Again, another one that I think I do remember seeing this one when it came out, but for some reason I didn't cover it at the time. But early kind of Master's Hammer. There's a couple of more contemporary references, especially in the vocals. They kind of reminded me of Cult de Ghoul, that Polish black metal band, very kind of ritualistic at times, very theatrical, but very well developed, like very deliberate in the way that it's paced out. It doesn't sort of fall apart into just being a bit self-indulgent, which sort of occult and theatrical black metal bands tend to do sometimes. They sort of forget to bind it together with some solid riffs and just go for more of just a sort of show of theatre, but this was very kind of tight and well written, despite the fact it was quite long. But it doesn't feel like that when you listen to it. So really good album, and I'm definitely going to be revisiting this one. Tyler, what were your thoughts on it?
This one also took me by surprise, because for some reason, on seeing the cover when I started it up, I expected war metal. It's not what I got. There was some Darkthrone riffs at times, interestingly enough. That kind of caught my attention. Other than that, though, it was kind of I don't want to say run-of-the-mill, but I was, kind of just could nod at it. Like, yep, that's some black metal in the gray area between black metal and early death metal, and some of those proto-extreme metal bands like Sodom and stuff like that, which, given, I guess, the pedigree of some of its members, makes sense. It wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but there wasn't anything here that would really recommend itself to me personally, or for people of my taste for repeated listening. You could play it and say, hey, that's an extreme metal band that plays that style and doesn't do it badly, but that's about all that I could say about it. I know that's probably kind of disappointing, but there wasn't really a lot for me to latch on to, and that's probably says more about me than about the album personally, but there were definitely parts, like I said, some parts where I heard riffs that kind of sounded like Darkthrone riffs where I thought that was pretty cool. So I was nodding along to some parts of the album, but overall, it's probably not going to be something I return to.
So yeah, for anyone listening to that, Tyler is wrong, but he's entitled to be wrong. Joseph, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, that was Tyler. What was the one you said I was wrong about?
Never mind.
His version of it. Yeah. I like this album quite a bit. It's like out of, I think, everything that you guys mentioned that I either wasn't familiar with or had kind of forgotten, this might be my favorite. I know I probably listened to this when it came out, but for whatever reason, because of new albums or life stuff happening, I guess I kind of forgot about it, which is a goddamn shame, because I think if this had been playing along with me, this probably would have been in top 20 at least, if not like top 15. My top 10's pretty solidified at this point, so it's kind of hard to see it bump further, but I think this is a really good album. It's interesting to see the band release this on Invictus and also Ajna in America, because those labels have very somewhat similar bands who are like some of my favorite contemporary black metal bands, like Negative Plane, Malakropatan, and just imagining Necromaniac play with them live would be a great fucking show for me. Similarly, like, definitely notice Master's Hammer, Mortuary Drape, maybe early Morbid Angel, Sarcophago, German bands, early Sepultura. In a lot of ways, it reminded me of Negative Plane. Just if Negative Plane were going a rather different direction, like. Oftentimes I feel like Negative Plane's guiding star is something like Mayhem's De Mysterious with a few other things, whereas I feel like this is much more pointed at something like Angel Corpse or Sarcophago, but pulling from very similar influences. And the only other thing I'd add, other than just it's a knockout album, it's great, is I really loved the moment listening on one of the longer tracks, Grave Mound Oath. There's little bells that are included, which just feels such like a Negative Plane kind of little touch that really kind of just pushes the song from a 9 to a 10.
Really solid use of timpani drums as well throughout. I think it's quite an underrated. I know there's the Master's Hammer link there, but also Immortal's debut, Diabolical Fulmin Mysticism, is just quite an underrated instrument, I think, in this kind of style of black metal. And yeah, just kind of just those little accents, those little details, really bring it to life. So yeah, great pick. Thank you for that one. Right, Tyler, on to your next pick. Now, I have it on good authority, it's pronounced Kæck. Do you want to introduce this one?
I don't know how to pronounce it, Shelley, so we're going to go with Kæck because you are the one with the good authority, and I am not. So Kæck.
Jason tells me it is pronounced Kæck, but that's my good authority. So
I'm friends with John Krutvagen, and I probably mispronounced his last name there too. I could just straight ask him, but I haven't gotten around to it because I'm embarrassed. But anyhow, yeah, we'll go with Kæck. I'm probably going to mispronounce the album title too. Gruwelijk Onthaal. This is pretty much my pick for album of the year. So it's just pretty much, it's got everything that I think everybody here, except for maybe Belisario, knows that I enjoy in a metal release, and that it's a just about a straightforward stream of melody, and then it has provides ample context through a contrast between grinding rhythmic riffs and soaring melodic sections that really kind of feature something that you see in both of John's bands, Sammath and Kæck, which is a kind of oddball old world style melody that sounds almost medieval, despite the very dirty, raw kind of war metal aesthetic. Interestingly, with this one, and I say interestingly, but I think you could hear Kæck going in this direction from the second album forward, especially. Not so much on the first album, although that might just be a consequence of the first album having a more prominent use of keyboards. You hear a lot more death metal influence on this one, a lot more influence creeping in from kind of incantation in part, and that kind of style, although it also has an approach in that's similar to other Dutch bands like Sinister or Pestilence. Is it similar enough to say a direct influence? I don't think so. But the thing that kind of unites those bands together, along with a group like Asphyx, for instance, is that contrast I brought up earlier between grinding rhythmic riffing and a kind of soaring style of melody, whatever the thematic approach of that may be. So yeah, this album was absolutely spectacular. There were moments in the album, like on the song that I'm not going to remember how to say right, Pater Hexelomat, that almost made me stand up out of my chair. They were so inspiring, which John's always been absolutely great at doing that. He did something similar with Last Gasp of the Dying on Ukarebabrug from Sammath in 2024. So yeah, spectacular album. I pre-ordered it. I pre-ordered the t-shirt. John, if you're listening to this, good job.
Yeah. There was like 3 albums that kept, when I was shortlisting for album of the year, that I kept switching them around as to what came at number 1, and this was one of those. So yeah, it could have easily been my top pick for 2025 as well. I think so. I think they released their debut album back in 2015, which was at the time like just a very like inspiring reassertion of quite traditional black metal, but just done in a really kind of modest, austere way, but in a way that kind of implies a vast world behind it. Like all of the component parts are really simple, really rudimentary, but they all come together and they just have this sort of inspiring mysticism to them. And then the follow-up, the name escapes me at the moment, but I remember that going in a much more of a death metal direction and being, well, maybe war metal more accurately. And I remember that being a bit of a curveball because the debut had that kind of brightness and kind of the frigid sort of atmosphere of what you'd expect from black metal, and that went in a much warmer, kind of heavier direction. And I think this one I think it's probably their best work to date. I wouldn't say it necessarily as a synthesis of the two. I'd say it more follows on from the second album in that it is still closely aligned to war metal, but if war metal was interesting, I think it is every bit as sort of savage and barbaric as that in terms of the way it's sort of in terms of its posture. But there is a whole, as you know, I can't really sort of build on what you said, Tyler, because you've already kind of said it all. But there's a lot going on, despite the fact that it is really simple. The fact that they use very simple keyboards to back up a lot of the riffs just leads to the fact that there's this implied power. It's almost like the equivalent of being in the presence of someone that you know is like really physically strong, but they never use their strength, but you know if they wanted to, they could. This album is very simple, but it kind of implies complexity behind that. And through like limiting itself in a lot of ways, both technically and in terms of song length and just complexity as well, the songs are, you know, very simple. But through all of that, it kind of builds complexity from that. There's a lot going on sort of behind the music itself that's all about implication. And I think that's kind of one of the fundamental things about good black metal is it is more than the sum of its parts. There's more going on behind the music than literally what's there on the record. Whereas something like death metal is kind of almost the opposite. It's maximalist. It's overproduction. There's almost too much going on. But from that, it's kind of all about organizing that chaos into something that could make sense from a certain logical point of view. This spiritually, although there are some death metal riffs going on throughout, spiritually it's very much like a black metal album in that regard, because it does more with less. Basically, that's the term I was thinking of. Yeah, it's yeah, that's it basically. Belisario, I know you were quite fond of this album as well. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this one, and I guess this is going to be a unanimous thing, unless Joseph says otherwise.
You may be shocked.
I was quite happy. Could happen. I was quite happy to see that this band came back to their style from the debut, because I liked also the second album, but the war metal influence didn't feel so interesting to me. And with this third album, I think they went back to the original formula. The revisiting the first black metal from the first wave, and but like doing it like in a more mature way, and all the songs are really well done, and each of them are pretty different among them, so it makes really an enjoyable album, and in a familiar style, but really done in a really good way. So this is really great.
Yeah. Joseph, is it going to be unanimous?
Unanimous.
Yeah!
I'm probably not as enthusiastic, but no, I would very much put this in the good column, or better than good. Yeah, I don't have too many negatives. Like it didn't, it didn't impress me as much as Necromaniac did, but no, I enjoyed this, especially as something I was very unfamiliar with. I kind of have a little joke for this one. What happens when you add atmosphere to a war metal band? You get holy war metal. It's that's kind of the feel I get with it. Like, again, the war metal comparisons, and even though that, like, I kind of hear more of an Impaled Nazarene thing kind of happening. I think, like all you guys said, it is, basic without that being a detriment. It knows what it's doing, and it's kind of plowing ahead. Again, you get a feel of like a tank. But like, if anyone's familiar with the like fictional game Trench Crusade, I feel like this would be really fitting music for that.
Yeah, I played Trench Crusade, and yeah, we've played this album while playing Trench Crusade before.
I nailed that then, didn't I? Yeah, it's like, again, it's got this atmosphere. The keys really, and this is kind of like, I think that issue I had with the album that Belisario mentioned, that sometimes there's stuff that's very bare bones, but just adding some even very basic keys can kind of elevate it. Like, to me, it's like a tank, but then it's like a tank swirling around with the ghosts of the dead it's crushed. Like, it just has this sort of spiritual aspect to it. And yeah, I found it really good. Not my favorite, but really good, really enjoyable, and the atmosphere really kicks it up a notch.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, definitely probably one of my favorites of the albums we've discussed so far, I think. So yeah, I'm glad someone picked it in the end. I think both me and Belisario were shying away from it because we knew one of us might pick it, and neither of us did in the end. But yeah, I'm glad you came in at the last minute to do that, Tyler. So my final pick is another old favorite of mine. I've been following these guys for years, and our second Colombian pick as well, a band called Cóndor. with their new album, their first in 7 years, I think. And I admire Tyler for plowing his way through those pronunciations. I'm not so good at these, even though I think this is a Tolkien reference. Aurë Entuluva. So this Cóndor, they, I guess bluntly you could describe them as Death Doom to some extent, but they have a lot more melodicism than is typical for that style. They reference Candlemas as being an explicit influence in what they do, but also you can hear folk music and definitely some classical and neoclassical influences. They've always suffered from sort of demo quality production, which if that kind of blocks you from enjoying an album, which I know it does for a lot of people, it can be a real kind of barrier. But if you can look past that, they're a very sophisticated guitar band in a lot of ways. And one of the reasons I've followed them for so long and found them so unique is their approach to composition and just fleshing out a piece is quite different it's very atypical for metal, because although you get very traditional parts to it, you can hear riffs and lead melodies that, oh yeah, that's just like a slowed down Iron Maiden harmony, and that's a Candlemas riff, and then they have a slightly heavier passage, or maybe they have something that's more classically like Black Sabbath or whatever. But it flows in a very idiosyncratic way that is, borderline neoclassical at times. But I always felt like they were reaching for that, but they never quite grasped it with their previous albums, whether it's sort of the limitations of the production, which is quite rough and ready, or just not quite pulling it together. That's not to say I didn't like the older albums. I absolutely love them, but this album kind of, you kind of hear it when it's done right, and it makes you reflect on the older material in a new light. And this is the album where I think they've finally come of age, even though they've been going for probably 15 years. So yeah, with this album, the production has improved. It's still a bit rough, but it's not anywhere near as like demo quality as like the debut and the second album. But they've also really developed into long form composition. So there's some very lengthy tracks on this album. I think there's only 6 or 7 tracks on here, but some of them are very long, but they flow like a suite, a classical suite. They've also, I think they've taken on a new guitarist. So there's 3 guitars on this album, and it really shows. And I think in that regard, it's kind of pulling on the legacy of an album like The Red in the Sky Is Ours, in terms of like counterpoint and really developing lead guitars, not as a kind of a solo or a centerpiece for an album, but just as a compositional tool. They're almost going beyond riffs by this point and just writing a flow of very traditional melodies in quite a classical way, but they also integrate elements of as folk music, and then the occasional just like classic kind of heavy metal riff on top of that as well. And for fear of sounding pretentious, but never mind, in my review of it I described it as deep metal. It's not a term I want to coin because it sounds a bit stupid, but deep metal in terms of just very fixated on the world building. So it's spiritually align it with something like Summoning. I mentioned The Red in the Sky Is Ours as well, which is what I describe as quite a deep album, or even maybe early Candlemas as well. It just very well composed and well thought out and well kind of sculpted together. And I think this is the album where they finally kind of became themselves, for want of a better word. Right. Who shall I call on first? Belisario, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Yeah, this one was really great and a big surprise because there's been so long since last album that I thought these guys weren't going to release anything else. So I was positively surprised to see there was something more from them coming. And in a way, I expected something different or surprising, because usually these guys are where on each album they were doing something different or slightly different. In this case, it's mostly like I would say a mature album, in the meaning that it's something they've done before, but more consolidated. In it, I hear like what they did on the latest album, which was like more a formula, more focused and centered, but with the same formula, with the same format they had on the first two albums, like longer songs and longer tracks. And maybe it's not so surprising as one could expect, but it's really well done, and it fits in their in the whole project, because it's a band that has been around already for 13 years. So in a way, they deserve, or it makes sense, they do something more recapitulative. Oh, I don't know how to say this. Like more conclusive, not experimental. And in this way, I really liked it a lot. So I think they became, with this album, this new one, they became the thing they set out to be since the beginning, to make a mixture between death, doom metal with slow rhythms, and mix with some kind of 70s flair for rock from like independently influenced, like a band like Wishbone Ash or some other more famous things from the 70s. So it's pretty accomplished, and it's a really nice entry, this one.
All right, so yeah, new Condor album. I have had a history of really wanting to like these guys, but my issue with them has always been that the music sounds somewhat like a patchwork quilt. You have portions that sound like classical guitar music, portions that sound like traditional heavy metal, portions that sound like atmospheric black metal a la Summoning, and it never really gelled for me. Thematically, it felt very detail-oriented. So Summoning, it has a very specific thematic focus on Tolkien's works that they deviate from infrequently from time to time, but it's kind of a sort of gesture rather than an intense kind of technical lore approach. And Cóndor doesn't, I wouldn't necessarily say that they fall into a kind of technical lore band, not like they have like a specific theme associated with them, like, I don't know, some kind of power metal band that focuses on the world of Faerun from Dungeons and Dragons or something as a gimmick. But it definitely felt more intellectually, don't want to use the word again, and I don't know if it necessarily fits, but artificed. And that's kind of a drawback for me personally. I like something to kind of more so paint a landscape that I can explore rather than describe every detail of the landscape to me. But, however, I think that this album is an improvement. It felt like they kind of have found a way to synthesize their disparate elements. It's not like they discarded the approach of bringing those different elements together, but they found a way to kind of make them flow into and out of each other to communicate something that was more of a clear experience rather than a pastiche of sorts or a collage of sorts of things that they enjoy. And I thought that was really great because I've always been rooting for this band. They definitely have a sort of they're on the same intellectual wavelength as things that I enjoy, and that is really awesome to see that brought out in a heavy metal group. It's just so often that when it's a little bit too self-conscious to be done well. So I'm very happy that Cóndor were able to kind of bring in riffs that had more spirit, more aggression in a way that wasn't just purely superficial, like rhythmic pounding, so to speak, but gave the songs a more sort of driving forward momentum feel. I really enjoyed that, and I'm excited to see where they go from here. This was surprising for me. It wasn't surprising enough to necessarily break into my top.
Okay, yeah, it's an interesting angle on it. I think I guess on the fundamentals we agree. I guess for me, I just like their style a little bit more, because I definitely agree this is both an improvement but also an improvement to the extent that they've almost sort of become something new. And I think really focusing on fleshing out their identity as a guitar-based band, but one that is quite unique and a little bit different in terms of the language of heavy metal has really sort of brought this to life for me. But I definitely take the point that earlier works sometimes are a little bit unfocused in that regard. In each element kind of is really well done, but it doesn't quite flow together quite so well. But I still kind of always took something away from them on a spiritual level. It almost felt like reading a very sort of wistful child's fairy tale, in that it's very dreamlike, in a way similar to Summoning as well, I suppose. Joseph, what were your thoughts on it?
It's interesting you mentioned wistful, because I definitely got that vibe. I'll be kind of short and sweet. I enjoyed it. This is a band I'm not terribly familiar with, and really this was kind of a first listen through, so I'm interested if I go back, hearing things I didn't hear before, or getting even more into it. It kind of reminded me a lot in different direction, but elements reminded me of kind of dark metal kind of thing, pulling from like Ulver and Agalok, but more harmonic death metal, like definitely some Amorphous and some other things, like a lot of kind of like some of those long forgotten, more harmonic, melodic death metal bands of the 90s. But again, with a very folky, melancholic, wistful kind of atmosphere to it. The production, I'd be curious to hear older stuff if there was more lo-fi than this. Not that it was extremely lo-fi, but it did kind of make me think of like demo quality of some bigger bands. I enjoyed it, and yeah, I'd be intrigued to listen more to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the earlier albums are not unlistenable, but yeah, they definitely feel like demo versions of like early. Yeah, I think you've kind of referenced it there with like early Amorphous and that kind of early melodic death metal or whatever. It feels like the demos from that era, but they're albums that were released in the 2010s. But to some extent, that lends it a charm. I know people often say that about bad production, but not in the sense that black metal is kind of required or is part of the composition. It did always feel like they were fighting against it to some extent, and I do sometimes wonder if some of these albums were kind of rendered in a professional studio, how much more of an audience they would draw in. But yeah, we can but speculate. Yeah, so that was I mentioned the Kæck as one of three that could have been my top album of the year. Cóndor was the second. The one that actually made it, Lethal Prayer, was the third, but I'm not discussing that now. Belisario, we're on to your next pick, which is the Thaumaturgy. Pestilential hymns.
Yes, I guess you must be familiar with it, since it's a band from the US, but not terribly famous, I suppose. And the thing I like a lot about this band, it's that it's a really well-done hybrid, because I've listened to earlier stuff from this band, which is a one-man band, if I'm correct. And in the beginning, it sounded a bit like a bit more OSDM, I would say, like more stuck on death metal. Sounded like more like Imprecation, Condemner, which means good references, but definitely more familiar. And with this new album is something different, because they get in it I hear the structure from a usual like older emulation style, but then the riffs and the textures sounds a lot more like black metal and an abrasive kind of expression, and the mix of it makes for a really different thing, like pretty original. And then the songs are really well worked and well done. And so I would say pretty much from the background and also the form, this is really outstanding. So one of my favorite albums from 2025, really.
Yeah, this one definitely cracked my top 10. I think it might have even cracked my top 5. And yeah, I remember reviewing the previous album and thinking it sits in that sort of cavernous death metal category, but a really solid like take on that. It didn't blow me away, but it was like a very competent iteration of that, and it's still like quite solid in that realm of like that style of cavernous death metal. Often you just get a lot of filler stuff and people kind of relying on the atmosphere to carry them through. Thaumaturgy actually did have a character behind them, but this takes it in a very different direction. And I guess it's like a black metal album that uses death metal compositional techniques, because the flow of it is very idiosyncratic. It's very kind of almost ambient in the way that it comes together. But if you sort of look at it front on, the actual things that are going on in the music, it is very physical and it is very kind of intentional in the way that it moves and flows in a way that you would normally associate with death metal, but it has this fluidity to it that is much more akin to black metal. And it's very kind of characterful in the way that the atmosphere it invokes, and the songs are quite they feel quite complex as well, even though you can't quite point to why. The gradients feel very kind of flattened off. It's a very I keep using the word fluid, but I can't sort of think of other words right now, but it's a very kind of intuitive album in that regard. But also when you unpack it, there's actually quite a lot going on, which again sort of brings me back to kind of this very, very sophisticated death metal album that flows in a more like atmospheric, ambient way. And it just, the title, Pestilential Hymns, it really does evoke that kind of imagery, and especially of the cover art as well. Very sort of desperate, fraught, dramatic album, but in a really kind of dignified way.
But yeah, I unfortunately, so this is the point of the episode where I bow my head in shame, not because I don't like this. I'm not about to throw that brick through the wall, but I just did not give this album enough time. I think I definitely heard a lot of what you guys mentioned, kind of the roots of the cacophonous death metal, but clearly trying to expand beyond that. I really just have to give this more time with it. Out of everything we covered, I think I just had maybe the least amount of feeling like I had somewhere to kind of stick my foot and kind of figure out where I wasn't in the album. And for that, I just need to dig in and listen to it more.
Yeah, that's fair enough. It's I guess it's just like a new spin on, or a slightly different spin on what's often called black and death metal, although the term is massively overused these days. But it is that in quite a literal sense, far more than a lot of bands that are described as such, because they play death metal, but it's slightly dark, forgetting that death metal has always been pretty dark. But this genuinely incorporates into the DNA of the riffs themselves a lot of black metal, and like I said, the way the sort of pacing of the tracks is more akin to black metal, but we've just played with a sort of death metal posture. Well done, Tyler, good work. Thaumaturgy, definitely one of the top picks, and I will be looking out for that EP, and it'll come when it'll come. It's always sort of a red flag if a band releases material too soon after a hit. So yeah, I'm glad to hear you're taking the time with it and making sure the material is as good as making sure that you're completely satisfied with the material before releasing it into the wild, which is more than I can say for a lot of bands that are currently active. So yeah, for time purposes, we're going to move to your next pick now, Tyler, before Joseph's, which is your final pick, the Arktheos Cosmonolith. Yeah, full disclosure, I only managed to listen to this one once, so I'm going to be kind of limited in what I can say about it, although calling back to what we were talking about with the first album we were discussing, Cultic, this one is another one where the album cover implies a very different album to what you get. I was thinking more either atmospheric black metal or more like fantasy-themed black metal, akin to Summoning, something sort of more medievalist, but instead you do get what is essentially like a war metal presentation, although slightly more sophisticated than that, as you kind of explained, Tyler, in terms of the composition. And it is very similar to the Kæck in a way, in what you were saying then, in terms of it's implying more than is actually put in front of the listener, and it does it through quite similar methods, although the outcome is very different from an experiential point of view. So yeah, it's also quite an aggressive, quite physical album, quite a muscular album. But yeah, I would definitely need to dig into it more to actually have more to say on it. So I'm going to sort of put this one on the list as a very, as you said, arrived quite late in 2025, and it's definitely going to be on my list for 2026 in terms of checking out, along with the Necromaniac, that I definitely need to spend more time on as well. Belisario, did you manage to get to this one?
Just once, like yourself, so I can't say anything definite, but I did like it. It sounds like some kind of dark and quite heavy death metal, so I did like it, but can't comment much about it. Maybe, as you say, the cover is a bit misleading, because I thought more about pagan black metal bands from the 90s, according to the cover, which was not at all the content. So I guess this one we have to put it with a misleading album cover list that we talk about tonight. Maybe the only really good cover from this year could be Kæck one.
I should say, it's a cool cover, and also bands can put whatever cover they want on an album, and I'm not trying to sort of limit what people do. I'm just saying, in this day and age, we do have preconceptions, and it is funny when they're just massively subverted. And to be honest, good on them. I put it on expecting one thing, I got something completely different, and that's my problem. It's not the band's problem. Anyway, Joseph, did you get to listen to this one?
Yeah, I did. It's interesting of Tyler's choices. I like I mentioned, I was with you guys and I enjoyed Kæck and want to dive into that even more. But of Tyler's three picks, Arktheos might be my favorite. I definitely want to check these guys out more. Again, like so many of these choices, I'm not familiar before, but I really, really enjoyed what I heard. Just really good riff writing that complements the drumming. I have a feeling Tyler wouldn't agree, but I really felt when listening to this, it reminded me a lot of Bolzer, and certainly the stuff from Bolzer that I like the most. Just really enjoyed it. Had this very kind of triumphant feel at the same time with a cosmic kind of feeling to it. The song "The River" has this great part, kind of a doomy mid-pace near the end, and then adding a little bit of keyboard choir really just had a great epic feel to it. and Feral Gnosis being another kind of highlight in it. Yeah, great album, very triumphant, very kind of warrior on the edge of time kind of feel.
Yeah, definitely one to revisit. And yeah, aside from like the discussions around album art as well, just bands that release albums late December. Again, it's not you can release an album whenever you like, but Mutilation as well. I'm speaking to you. If you're going to release an album between Christmas and New Year, it's going to get missed off all the lists, and it's just going to fall into 2026. I'm afraid that's just the way it is. But yeah.
But I think sometimes it's worse to release it in January, like the Necromaniac. I think it was forgotten for many because of that.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, when I'm shortlisting, I do try and scope out the entire year and just go back over everything. But you're right. If I've missed something, then yeah, it will get double missed. But yeah, something like, I mean, Hate Forest have a habit of doing this as well, like releasing albums on Boxing Day or whatever. But yeah, again, it's up to us to sort of find this stuff. And obviously the Mutilation, I did come across it eventually, but obviously it completely fell off the radar for 2025, but which is a shame because it's a really good album. Anyway, that is by the by. Our final pick is Joseph's, and it is the, how do you pronounce this one? NyreDolk? This is the album that I was going to play earlier, and my son kept telling me to turn it down because it was too fucking loud, and it is a loud-ass album. Do you want to introduce this one?
Yes. No, I think you pronounced it right. Although, everything is in Danish, so I have a hard time with that. NyreDolk, Barndommens Hem. That's my butchering Danish, I think. This band was known kind of in the underground scene that they're in, part of that, I'm forgetting the name of it, but very particular scene around Copenhagen with a lot of black metal rooted but peculiar type of bands. Like another one in that scene actually did a great album, but a little further down my list was Gabstock. But yeah, these guys I've been crazy for since their EPs or demos, depending on how you categorize them, from 2018, 2020. I think I saw on YouTube from 2019, they played the Metal Magic Festival in Denmark and just visually blew me away. This is a band that I'm dying to see live because I get such a feeling of actual danger. And it's been a while since a band has kind of given me that feeling. The sound, I should get to that first, but the sound is black metal, but very punk influenced. And of course, when someone hears that, it's like, okay, well, what the hell do you mean by punk? I mean, because there have been some albums by some bands this past year who, as Tyler kind of hinted, basically sound like a black metal version of Blink-182 or Green Day or some sort of screamo thing. I don't mean that. I mean punk in kind of a crusty sense, kind of 82 kind of sound. Like if I had to pin it anywhere, it'd be like GBH on the one hand, maybe even a little Discharge, but more GBH, I think. And then on the other hand, some of the weirdness of the punk scene in the 80s, something like Rudimentary Peni. So you take that and add it to the black metal formula, which again just makes enough sense given that Core Throne cited GBH as a big influence. So musically, it's coming from that. It's very short. It's very fast. Although this album has some interesting experiments, even has some moments of clean singing, and I think even some guest female vocals, which adds a really interesting kind of element to it. It certainly makes those tracks stand out a bit. Visually, though, they go for a pretty unique thing. Ski masks in most of the band or hoods. And then the lead singer basically has something straight out of a 1920s scenario gangster thing of like a hood sack over the head, with, crudely cut eyes and just phlegm, spit, and bile and blood dripping down the front of it from where he's screaming. And seeing them live, they're pretty unhinged, at times falling into the audience, singer jumping into the crowd. Not that they're the only band who's ever done that, but it's certainly, bands that do that, it's usually an interesting experience. I know Neil Jameson from Krieg has been cheerleading this band a lot, often comparing them to Bone Owl and Iljarn, his influences, and I'd highly recommend an interview he did on his Substack with the band. I think it's one of the few interviews that exists with NyreDolk, and they go into some interesting aspects that I never knew about, that like a lot of the lyrics and themes of the songs are dealing with like childhood traumas. So again, it's not punk in sort of a explicitly political or partisan sense, more dealing with kind of emotional turmoil and dread from that. You can check out that video I mentioned, check out the music video they did for Moderliv. I think it gives you a good idea of what this band was like. And hopefully, if not over here, I can at least get over to Denmark at some point in the next year or two and see these guys live.
Cool. So Tyler's had to drop off. He's got other commitments. So it falls to me to be the naysayer. This was, I know you've just waxed lyrical about them, Joseph, but unfortunately this was probably my least favorite of the albums we've discussed so far. I get everything you're saying, I suppose. Definitely the punk influence. I also got a bit of an industrial vibe to some of it. The percussive elements were very kind of mechanical, and I did really like the addition of the female vocals. I think it added quite an eerie atmospheric element to what is otherwise quite kind of raw physical music. But I do hear a lot of bands like this that are going for that quite raw, aggressive, muscular take on black metal, and whilst they aren't as bad as some of them, I find it quite tedious in a lot of ways, purely because I don't see anything beyond the amalgamation, I suppose, as sort of we're undergirding elements of kind of war metal or black metal with the sort of punk physicality, a little bit of like modernist industrial quirkiness, and then some of her own flair, and it just doesn't do it for me. And I think it might be the intersection of maybe industrial and black metal. I think it's quite rare for me to find a band outside of someone like, say, Black Funeral or something that does that right. And again, with the sort of the look and the influences, they felt like a more like cyber Midnight, and I'm not a particularly big fan of Midnight as well, although I know they're very popular amongst a certain crowd, where it just feels a bit tired and stale, and trying to kind of bolster it up with presentation. But yeah, sorry if that's too brutal, but that's the impression I got from it. It just wasn't for me. Belisario, did you listen to this one?
I had a couple of listens, and I agree more with you than with Joseph for this one. Sorry. But in a way, it does sounds like Iljarn. That's the influence I got when listening to it, like more energetic version of it. But still, it is a bit too punk, maybe too hardcore punk for me, like too direct and too immediate for me to appreciate it. Sorry for that.
No, I can see why someone like Neil Jameson likes it as well, because he's a musician I massively respect, and I read his Substack, and I do really enjoy it. But he also comes from that tradition of black metal that's very rooted in punk. I know a lot of black metal is, but sort of quite explicitly so, whereas a lot of the time it's kind of more implied, I suppose. And I could definitely see why he would enjoy it. But I've never been a particular fan of Bonal as well, even though I know a lot of that comes from Iljan, who is, as I've sort of mentioned before, is one of my favourite Norwegian artists. But yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm not on it. And the thing is, I mean, I know Neil mentions those, and I'm not even the biggest Bone Owl or Iljan fan. Like for me, again, like I kind of felt like GBH or Rudimentary Peni again mixed in with, something like Dark Throne and Bathory, early Bathory, I guess kind of gives me the feel. It's interesting you mentioned the industrial. I kind of have to go back and maybe try to pinpoint that. I could definitely probably see that. I mean, I think they wouldn't be afraid of citing Throbbing Gristle or something like that as an influence. Yeah, and again, it's a very primal thing. And again, if you're not one inclined to very punk leaning and the kind of extreme hardcore, it makes total sense that it just wouldn't vibe for you. It's not everyone's cake. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed.
Everyone's cake.
I didn't even mean to do
I thought the same.
I guess again, this is just, I get a lot of shit for this, and I got a lot of shit for it over the Messa article, but I get that genres meld and blend all the time, and that's kind of how music develops. But sometimes I like the segregation to some extent, where I really like hardcore punk, I like GBH, I like Discharge, and so on, and I really like black metal. But sometimes when they so explicitly meld together, it doesn't quite sit right for me. And there are ways to do it. I was mentioning like someone like Black Funeral with the industrial thing. Obviously, Iljan drew a lot from that. You mentioned early Bathory as well. I just didn't find this one subtle enough, but there might just be me nitpicking. But there are versions of this sound that do really resonate with me. But this one just didn't quite get there. But yeah, I'll definitely keep an eye on them, because, like I said, there were elements of this album that I really did like that were quite quirky and out there. But yeah, I just feel bad that we're ending on a downer. But
well, and the one thing I would say is, I mean, you being in the UK, you have a better chance, and Belisario probably too, being in Spain. Like, I don't think they play live that far from home. So, like, if you get a chance to see them, please do.
Oh, yeah, definitely. After you described the live shows, it sort of seems worth it just for that. So, yeah. Cool. Okay. So, yeah, that's our rundown of 2025. Obviously, it's not a comprehensive list. We've been going for over 2 hours now, and we've only managed to get through, 12 albums? But we decided to limit to 3 each of, like, just random picks from our best of lists. But yeah, as I said at the start, I think in general it was a pretty damn good year for underground metal in particular. And I'm glad that we're kind of back up and running just to discuss some of it. So yeah, thanks for sticking around, and thanks for waiting around for this episode, because I think it has been nearly a year since we last posted. And also, yeah, thanks to Tyler, who unfortunately had to dip out, but yeah, really enjoyed his contributions. And thank you very much, Belisario. Really enjoyed your contributions today, and always good to hear your takes on stuff, even though I think we pretty much are of one mind on a lot of this. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for reminding me.
And yeah, Joseph, as always, really appreciate you bringing some of this stuff to us. I know we do disagree on some of this stuff, and we obviously have a heated debate over whether doom metal exists, but we'll come to that another time. Maybe we'll do a separate episode on that. But no, I really appreciate you bringing some albums that wouldn't have necessarily come my way otherwise, and also just, yeah, bringing a different take on things. So yeah, really glad to have you on.
Thank you. And yeah, no, I thoroughly enjoyed, I mean, from all of you guys, I've got at least one more album to listen to multiple times more. So thank you.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. Thanks for sticking around. Hopefully there'll be more episodes coming very soon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.